You're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the FT's political correspondent, Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe, and the Daily Mail's deputy political editor, John Stevens. They'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. Well, the Mirror leads with the stabbing of the author Sir Salman Rushdie at an event in New York State. The Times reports that Sir Salman was stabbed as many as 15 times. The Mail pictures the efforts to give him first aid. The same photo appears on the front of The Sun. The Express describes the incident as a frenzied attack. It's also the main story for The Telegraph. The Guardian, too, leads with the Rushdie attack by a masked man just as he was about to give a speech. In other news, the Eye says one of the main consequences of the drought is that it's likely to be that crops will shrink. While the Star has seen research which found that rivers inhabited by beavers are less prone to be affected by droughts. And the Financial Times reports on the increasing government debt and welfare costs which will be inherited by the next Prime Minister. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe and John Stevens. Welcome to you both. Well, let's start with this awful attack and then the story on Sir Salman Rushdie in New York as he was about to speak on stage. Let's start with the Daily Mail and their headline, Rushdie stabbed up to 15 times. Jasmine.
Yeah, I mean, there are still a lot of unknowns about what exactly happened, and we don't exactly know the motivation of the attacker, but some details are starting to emerge. We know that Sir Salman Rushdie, he was due to be giving a talk, and as part of that talk, he was supposed to be talking about how the US was a haven for creative expression. There are some details emerging. I think we saw front page of the Times that witnesses suggest that he was stabbed up to 10 to 15 times. So it was clearly an incredibly violent and brutal attack. And as we know that he's now in hospital and they're trying to urgently treat him. But I think there will be all sorts of questions in the next coming days about the security at the event and how an individual was allowed to get so close and allowed to bring weaponry to an event, because we know that Sir Salman is someone who has been on the receiving end of death threats for years now. So I think a lot of the details are still unknown, but I think it will gradually get a better understanding in the next couple of hours and days.
Yes, and John, as Jasmine says, thoughts will turn to security, knowing Sir Salman's history with the fatwa that was issued in the 80s on the authoring of the satanic verses.
Yeah, and after that fatwa was issued, he went into hiding for around a decade, but clearly he'd felt much more comfortable in recent years. He gave an interview to The Times back in 2015 and talked about how for the last 16 years he'd used the subway like normal, he'd used taxis like normal. And so, as Jasmine says, there will be questions about his security. There's suggestions in some of the papers that people were able to attend this event without having to go through bag searches, that he didn't appear to have any obvious bodyguards there. And so there will be questions about, was the security appropriate when there were these threats to him? But one of the things that Salman Rushdie said himself was that he regretted going into hiding for 10 years, that he wished he hadn't done that, and he wished that he'd refused to do that. And so clearly he was making that decision that he didn't want to live that kind of life locked up away from all these risks.
But yes, Jasmine, in later years, he was trying to live his life as a normal citizen, going about his daily business.
Yeah, I think so. And I think he is, as John said, he is someone who has given interviews. He's someone who has insisted that he won't be cowed, and he's always been an advocate for freedom of expression. And we've seen several authors, for example, J.K. Rowling, and political figures such as Boris Johnson and the former House Secretary Sajid Javid come out in support of Sir Salman and arguing that it's an example of potentially freedom of speech being under attack. That those the words of Sajid Javid on Twitter earlier today. And I do think the attack will reignite all those difficult questions about trying to get the balance right of freedom of speech versus respecting cultures and religions. And I do think we're going to see that play out in the next couple of days.
Yes, let's move on to the Telegraph, and there's some more detail about the attack. And the irony, I suppose, is that he was speaking on the freedoms of speech at this literary event, John.
Yeah, he was talking about how the US was a refuge for authors who were under threat. And you've got to remember the history with this book and how much kind of upset it caused back in the 80s. You know, the papers have gone through about how it wasn't just Salman Rushdie who was the subject of these threats. It was people who were involved in translating the book into other languages, people who were publishing it. Someone who translated it into Japanese was killed back in the early 90s, I think. Someone who was the publisher in Norway was shot in the head outside their home. And there are also people who were killed in massive protests that took in different places around the world. So, yeah, this book has had massive effects on the world. And obviously a lot of people are very concerned tonight about Salman Rushdie and what's happened to him. As one of your reporters said earlier on in the programme, you know, we haven't heard many updates since in the last few hours. Obviously, when it happened, we heard reports that he was able to walk off stage before getting treatment. But since he's been airlifted to hospital, you haven't really had many updates on his condition. And you think if those reports are right about how he was stabbed 15 times, including in the neck, it is just a very worrying time.
Yes, we have since then had an update from the New York State Police Department, and they've informed us that he is undergoing surgery at present. In the article in the Daily Telegraph, they quote Boris Johnson, and he's saying that he's appalled that Salman Rushdie has been stabbed while exercising a right we should never cease to defend. Right now, my thoughts are with his loved ones, and we're all hoping he's OK. Also in the attack, Henry Rees, the interviewer who was on stage with Sir Salman, he also received a minor head injury, we read. Yasmin.
Yeah, I mean, we are getting the intricacies of these details coming out, and there's still, I can imagine it was an incredibly chaotic scene, and I can imagine there's still a lot of confusion as to what exactly happened. But it is striking that we are seeing individuals like Boris Johnson come forward and say that actually the ideas of freedom of speech are something that we have to all defend. And I think it's quite a striking intervention, and it shows that even, as John said, the book was published in the 80s, and it's quite a while ago now, but actually it still resulted in huge ramifications for those involved in translating, for those still linked to the book. And it shows that, yes, it was certainly a long time ago, but actually the issues surrounding the text and the controversy that surrounded it are still very much alive and present today.
Let's have a look at the Eye. We'll move on to the story of the drought. And they're detailing a piece suggesting that the drought is likely to shrink crops. John.
Yeah, this is a story about, obviously, we've seen the impact of the hot weather on parks. There's been those pictures in papers for days with all the grass dried up. We've seen the impact in our gardens, and we've heard about the threat of things like hosepipe bans. But now this is talking about how this is creating real problems for farmers. It's talking about particular crops, potatoes, carrots and onions, and how the lack of water means that we're going to get lower yields. Also, the individual vegetables are going to be smaller this year. And in that article, it quotes the NFU, and they're calling on supermarkets to relax some of their rules on product specifications, so you're more likely to get kind of slightly smaller onions or potatoes on the shelves, or wonky veggie. And they're talking about if we don't do this, there are going to be even more problems with price. And we know with all the problems going on in Ukraine and how that's impacted crops and oil production, and also with petrol prices going up and how that's already led to shop prices going up and up and up. This is going to be yet more pressure on shoppers.
Jasmine, tell us via the Star how beavers might help with the drought.
So, I mean, a slightly light-hearted take on a very serious issue, but I think it's an example of how ecosystems are so sensitive, and we have no idea really how the changing climate and changing weather patterns will impact animals in local areas. But the STAR is indicating that one potential benefit is that actually, I think lakes and rivers where there are lots of beavers, they're less likely to dry out or something like that. But I think for all the lightheartedness, I think it's interesting that we've actually seen a change in tone when it comes to reporting of the weather patterns lately. Normally when we've got a couple of hot days in the UK, you see pictures of packed beaches and, tabloids giving us all those puns. Whereas I think now there's a real shift that this isn't just a couple of hot days. We seem to be having a continued pattern of, not having enough rain, having weather that's hot enough to damage infrastructure, to damage health, to start impacting our reservoirs. And I do think that there is a growing sense of urgency among environmental campaigners and also among political leaders that actually we do need to be looking at what our water companies are doing, what are the long-term plans in place to deal with some of these changing weather patterns that we're seeing.
Indeed, Jasmine and John, thank you very much for the moment. Do stay with us. Much more coming up after the break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. Still with me, Jasmine Cameron-Chileshe and John Stevens. Welcome back to both of you. Let's take a look at the FT weekend and this article about, what will be in the in-tray for the incoming Conservative Prime Minister. Debt payment and welfare bill set to soar. Put my teeth back in. John, take us into this story.
Yeah, so this is some yet more worrying figures about the economy, and the FT has done an analysis looking at how much the cost of borrowing for the government's going to go up in the next couple of years because of the rise in interest rates and the rise in inflation. And it talks about how I think there's about £500 billion worth of government debt, which is linked to the consumer price index. And because obviously inflation is at a 30-year high, that is going up. And it's talking about how I think the cost of borrowing is going to go up for the government around £50 billion to £95 billion next year. And it also talks about how a lot of benefits obviously linked to inflation, and the government's going to end up spending a lot more on that. And it just means that it's even more of a headache for whoever takes over the running of the country. And obviously during the campaign, we've heard lots of different promises from Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. And Liz Truss has said a lot of them, she said there's headroom, that she does have an ability to do a lot of her tax cuts without any extra borrowing, whereas this brings that into question and suggests some of those forecasts on the economy that were drawn up by the OBR at the time of the last budget now look rather out of date.
Yes, they quote Professor Charlie Bean, a former OBR committee member, said that the pressures on the public finances meant that the permanent tax cuts promised by Truss were irresponsible. Liz Truss is thinking of permanent reductions in the tax burden, and it's a pretty open question whether £30 billion of headroom is still there. Jasmine.
Yeah, so we're in this really strange period at the moment where there's almost a bit of a political vacuum because we've had all these negative headlines about the economy. We know that the economy shrank between April and June of this year. We now know that energy prices are predicted to rise above £4,000 by next April. So we've had all these negative headlines about the economy, and it looks like come autumn we're going to be in quite a tricky situation. But we're in this position where the Prime Minister and Downing Street have said that they're not actually able to intervene for the time being. We're going to have to wait till September. And then we have Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak giving us their ideas about how they're going to tackle the cost of living crisis. But there's scepticism about whether or not they're even practical. I think they're clear on what they ideologically believe. Sunak wants to tackle inflation and he wants to reduce borrowing, whereas Liz Truss wants to embark on a series of tax cuts. But I think there's that tension between what they believe and actually what the economy will allow come September when the new PM has to come into office.
Let's finish with the Times, should we, John? And this piece about the fact that English A-level is not as popular as it once was, is slipping down the rankings in favour of science subjects.
Yeah, a decade ago, English literature was the most popular A-level subject. But according to these rankings, it looks like, I think it's going to fall out of the top 10. And that might sound a bit concerning, but you look at the subjects that are doing particularly well. Maths is at the top of the list, You've got biology and chemistry very high. I think history's gone down slightly, but it's number 6 in the table. I think this is probably a good thing if people are switching to science and math subjects, that for a long time people have been kind of encouraging it, saying we want more people to take them up, and it appears that people are taking on that message and actually doing it.
Jasmine was smiling there. Do you disagree?
I'm slightly biased, having done an English degree and having absolutely loved English. I remember the look on my parents' face when I said I was doing an English degree. I mean, I do think it's important that we have students studying maths and all the sciences that get you into, some of these jobs that we really need, for example, jobs in the NHS. But I also think we shouldn't downplay the importance of the humanities. And, this is the country that gave us Shakespeare and these amazing works of literature. And we also shouldn't forget that as well.